It was the third week of October, and the frost had come early that year. Vivienne Aldcroft had walked 4 miles in boots that had been re-soled twice and were beginning to separate at the left heel. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder and $31 and some change folded into the lining of her coat. That was all. The house in Carleton had been sold to cover her father's debts, and the solicitor in town had been very kind about it, which had somehow made it worse. She was 24 years old, and she had nowhere to go. The road north of Dunmore, Alberta, was empty at that hour, just past mid-morning. The sky the color of old pewter, the fields on either side shorn and flat and pale. She had heard in town that a man named Callum Dray ran a grain operations about 6 miles from the crossroads, and that he had been short-handed since the Harker brothers left for the coast in August. She did not know if that meant anything for her. She was not a farmhand, but she could cook, and she could keep books, and she could work longer than people expected her to. She came over a low rise in the road and saw the property below. A white-painted farmhouse set back from a windbreak of spruce trees, 2 red barns, a granary, a bunkhouse with smoke rising from its pipe. A tractor was pulled beside the near barn with its hood up. A man in a brown canvas coat was bent over the engine. He did not look up when she came down the drive. She stopped a few feet from him. "Excuse me," she said. He straightened slowly. He was taller than she had expected, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by years of wind and sun into something that gave away very little. He might have been 40 or thereabouts. He had grease on his hands, and he wiped them on a cloth without hurrying. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for Mr. Dray, Callum Dray, that's me." Vivienne adjusted the strap of her bag. "My name is Vivienne Aldcroft. I came from Dunmore. I was told you might be short a cook for the harvest crew." He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, but steadily, the way a man looks at something he is trying to take an honest measure of. "Who told you that?" "Mr. Fentress at the co-op." He folded the cloth and laid it on the engine block. "You done this before? Cooking for crew?" "I cooked for my father and the men he hired every season since I was 15. We ran a mixed operation, about 300 acres, some cattle. He passed in September. The farm is gone." She said it plainly, because there was nothing to be gained by saying it any other way. Callum Dray looked at the sky for a moment, then back at her. "It's 7 men right now. Could go to 10 if the weather holds, and we bring in the Lethbridge crew. I can cook for 10. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You need a place to stay?" "Yes, there's a room off the kitchen. Small. Used to be a pantry." "That's fine." He nodded once, as if that settled it, and turned back to the tractor. "Dinner's at 6. They'll want something substantial. Stove takes a while to come up to heat. You'll want to start by 4. That was all. No contract, no handshake, no welcome. Vivienne picked up her bag and walked to the farmhouse. The kitchen was large and cold and clean. Someone had kept it orderly. The pots hanging on their hooks, the flour in a proper tin, the wood box full beside the stove. She opened the cold room off the back and took stock. There was salt pork, potatoes enough for a week, dried beans, canned tomatoes, a wheel of old cheddar wrapped in cloth, eggs in a wire basket, and 2 ducks that someone had hung and not yet dealt with. She looked at the ducks for a long moment, then went and found a knife. By the time the crew came in at 6, the kitchen smelled of roasted duck and potato soup and fresh bread, and the table was set for 8. The men filed in without much ceremony. They were tired, the way harvest men are tired, deep in the body, and they sat and filled their plates and ate with the focused quiet of people who have worked hard enough to be truly hungry. One of them, a young man with red hair and a sunburned nose, looked up from his bowl and said, "That's the best soup I've had since my mother's." and several of the others nodded without speaking. Callum Dre sat at the end of the table. He ate carefully, not quickly, and he did not offer an opinion on the food, but he had a second bowl of soup, and she noticed. After supper, she cleared the table and washed up and went to her room, which was indeed small, but had a window and a good latch, and a narrow bed with a wool blanket. She sat on the edge of the bed in her coat for a while, listening to the sounds of the farm settling in the dark. Then she unpacked her bag slowly and lay down and slept better than she had in weeks. The days had a shape to them, and she found comfort in that. She was up before 5, the kitchen cold, her breath visible in the air above the stove while she coaxed the fire. She made oatmeal or eggs or pancakes for the crew and had coffee ready before they pulled on their boots. She packed lunches, biscuits, cold meat, pickles, dried fruit, and sent them out with the men. Then she cleaned up and spent the middle hours in the root cellar or the cold room, or in town if Callum left the truck, which he sometimes did on Tuesdays when he had to go to the bank in Dunmore. He always left a note on the kitchen table when he did. "Truck's yours if you need it. Back by noon." That was all. No signature. She used those Tuesdays to buy what the kitchen needed, always bringing back the receipt and the change and setting them on the table beside his coffee cup. He never commented on it, but one Tuesday she came back from town to find a box of brown sugar on the counter. She had mentioned the week before that the molasses cake needed it, with no note and no indication of where it had come from. She stared at it for a moment and then put it away and made the cake. The crew noticed her work before Callum said anything about it. The red-haired man, whose name was Owen, started leaving his muddy boots at the back door without being asked. The older fellow, a quiet man named Bernard, who had been with the operation for 3 seasons, began clearing the table after supper without being asked either. Small things, but she noticed them. October turned to November. The last of the grain came in under gray skies. And there was a tension on the property for about 4 days when the forecast called for early snow, and everyone worked later than usual and ate standing up in the kitchen because there wasn't time to sit. She kept the stove going and the coffee hot and made food in batches. Pots of chili, cornbread, rice with salt pork, things that kept and could be eaten fast. She slept 4 hours a night during that stretch. The snow held off. The grain went into the elevators. On the evening of the last day, Callum came into the kitchen at 9:30 and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the fact that she had already cleaned up and had a kettle on. He sat down at the table. She poured him a cup of tea without asking and set a plate of oatmeal cookies beside it, because she had made them that afternoon, knowing the men would want something when it was over. He picked up a cookie and ate it, and looked at the table. "Good week," he said finally. "Yes," she said. That was all. But something had shifted slightly, the way the temperature shifts a degree or two before a thaw, not yet warm, but no longer quite so cold. The harvest crew left in the second week of November, Owen last of all, tipping his hat to her in the doorway. "You'll be here in spring?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "Hope so," he said, and went. The property went quiet. It was just Callum and Bernard and a part-time hand named Roy, who came in for cattle work, and the days stretched out differently, longer and darker and very still. Vivienne found herself reorganizing the pantry. Then the cold room, then the account books, because Callum had asked her, offhandedly, as if it had just occurred to him, whether she could look at them. He'd said the numbers didn't agree with what was in his head, and he didn't trust his own arithmetic. She sat at the kitchen table with the books for a long evening in early December, Callum on the far side of the room, repairing a length of harness, neither of them talking. At a certain point she found the problem, a consistent error in how the grain sales had been recorded, which had been compounding for 2 seasons. "Mr. Dre," she said. He looked up. "Your yield last year was better than you thought. Significantly better. Someone was recording your net as gross and subtracting twice." She turned the book toward him and showed him the column. He came and stood over her shoulder and looked at it for a long time. She could hear him breathing. "By how much?" he said. "About $1,100. He straightened up slowly. She expected him to say something, but he just went back to the harness and worked in silence for a while. Then, without looking up, "You want to take over the books permanent?" "Yes," she said. "If you like." "I'd like," he said, and that was the whole conversation. December came in hard. The temperature dropped to 20 below for a week, and the cattle needed extra feed, and the pipes in the bunkhouse froze and had to be thawed with a heat lamp. Bernard slept in the barn 2 nights to keep an eye on the younger animals. Vivienne made thermoses of soup and brought them out twice a day without anyone asking her to. One evening she was crossing the yard in the dark, with a thermos in each hand, when she slipped on a patch of ice near the water trough. She caught herself, barely, one hand going down onto the frozen ground, the thermoses somehow upright. She sat there for a moment on one knee, catching her breath. Callum was there before she could get up. He had seen from the window, she supposed. He didn't say anything. He took the thermoses from her and set them down, and then offered his hand, and when she took it, he pulled her up with a steadiness that suggested it cost him nothing. "You're all right?" he said. "I'm fine." She brushed the ice off her palm. He picked up the thermoses and looked at her coat. "You need a heavier coat than that. This coat is fine." He made a sound that was not quite agreement and handed her back one of the thermoses. They walked to the barn together. 2 days later, a wool-lined work coat appeared on the hook by the back door. Her size. It had a note pinned to it, just, "In case," no name. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she put it on. It was very warm. She did not let herself think about what any of it meant. She was practical by nature and by necessity, and she knew that a man like Callum Dre did not give things away easily, not trust, not words, not actions, and so when he gave them it was easy to make more of them than perhaps was warranted. She had a roof and work and a wage, and she would not ruin that by imagining things, but the imagining was harder to control in January, when the days were short and dark, and she and Callum were often the only 2 people on the property. And she had learned the sound of his truck on the drive, and found herself aware of when he came in and when he didn't. He was not talkative. Some men who are quiet because they have nothing to say. Callum was quiet in a way that felt more like compression, as if there were a great deal inside, but very little of it had ever found its way out. He read in the evenings when the work was done. Evening, sitting by the wood stove with his boots off and a book open on the arm of the chair, and sometimes he fell asleep there, and she would put the guard on the fire before she went to her room. Once she came in from the cold room to find him at her side of the kitchen table, her account book open in front of him. He was not snooping. The books were his after all, but he was looking at her handwriting with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Something wrong?" she asked. He looked up, and for just a moment there was something in his face that was not the usual reserve. "No," he said, and closed the book gently, as if it were something worth handling with care. "Nothing's wrong." She poured herself a cup of tea and stood at the window and looked at the snow. February brought a thaw that didn't last, and then a hard freeze that broke a window in the granary, and they spent 2 cold days boarding it up until the glazier could come out from town. Callum was up on a ladder doing the higher work, and Vivienne was below handing up boards and holding the ladder steady when Mr. Cecil Garner, the man who held the paper on the east field, drove into the yard in his gray sedan. She knew who he was from the account books. He had been raising the interest on a loan that Callum's father had taken out 20 years prior, each renewal more unfavorable than the last. The current terms were, in her professional assessment, she had done 2 years of bookkeeping for her father's solicitor before coming home to nurse him. Unconscionable. Callum came down from the ladder. Mr. Garner was a thin man in a good coat, and he had the particular manner of someone who believes that money confers patience on the holder of it and urgency on those who owe it. "I've come about the renewal, Dre," he said, not looking at Vivienne. Callum nodded once. "Terms are the same as last year. I need your signature by the end of the month." "I'll need to look it over," Callum said. "Of course." Mr. Garner handed him an envelope. "I'll expect to hear from you by the 15th. He got back in his sedan and drove out of the yard. Callum stood with the envelope in his hand. He looked at it the way he looked at things he didn't fully trust, carefully, without expression. "May I?" Vivienne said. He handed it over. She read it in the kitchen while Callum finished with the granary. When he came in, she had the documents laid out on the table, and her account book open beside them, and a pencil in her hand. "Sit down, Mr. Dre," she said. He sat. She showed him what she had found. Not just the interest rate, which was 2.5 points above anything reasonable, but the compounding structure, which had been written in language designed to obscure. Over 10 years, at this rate, he would pay back 3 times the original principal. At current grain prices, the East Field would never produce enough to justify it. "You have options," she said. "The credit union in Lethbridge is offering agricultural loans at better terms. I can write the application. You have 2 seasons of clean books now. Your debt-to-yield ratio is stronger than you think, and the equipment is paid off. You are a better borrower than Mr. Garner has let you believe." Callum sat very still. She had noticed he did this when he was thinking, became more still, not less. "You'd do that," he said. "Write the application. Yes, it would take me about a day." He looked at the papers on the table for a moment. "Why?" he said. It was such a simple question that for a moment she didn't know how to answer it. "Because the numbers are wrong and wrong numbers bother me," she said finally. "And because it's your land." He looked at her then, a long, direct look that she had learned to recognize as his most honest form of communication, the thing he did when words would not come easily. "All right," he said. She wrote the application in 3 days. Callum drove her to Lethbridge. On a Friday morning, the roads icy and the sky white, and they sat together in the credit union office while a man named Mr. Holbrook asked questions, and Vivienne answered them with the account books open on her knee. Callum answered only when asked directly, which was not often, because she had the numbers. Mr. Holbrook said he would be in touch within the week. They ate lunch at a diner near the river before driving back. It was the first time they had been anywhere together that was not the farm, and it had a slightly unfamiliar quality. Sitting across a table from him in a public place, in daylight, with other people around them. He had combed his hair, she noticed. He ordered the beef stew and a coffee, and did not look at the menu for more than 10 seconds. "Have you been to Lethbridge much?" she asked, because the silence felt different here than it did at home, less familiar. "Not much," he said. "Cattle sales mostly. Bank." He paused. "You?" "I used to come with my father. He liked the river." He nodded slowly. "Good river," he said. She looked out the window at the ice on the edges of the water and agreed that it was. The credit union approved the loan in 10 days. Callum came into the kitchen one Tuesday morning and put the letter on the table in front of her without saying anything, and she read it and looked up. He was watching her. "That's good news," she said. "Yeah." He picked up his coffee. "You should know, I've been thinking about putting you on as a proper manager, not just cook and books, the whole operation." She looked at him for a moment. Mr. Dre, I know it's more than you agreed to when you came. You can say no. I'm not saying no, she said. That's a significant offer. I know what it is, he said. She looked at the letter again, then folded it along its crease. I'll need a proper wage, that's fair, and a title. Something in writing. I can do that. She nodded. Then yes. He picked up his coat from the hook and went back out to the barn, and she sat for a moment at the kitchen table with her coffee and the letter. And the feeling that her life had quietly, without announcement, become something she had not expected. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in southern Alberta, mud before warmth, brown fields before green, the cattle restless and the ground soft enough to swallow a boot. Vivienne was in the yard, on a Saturday morning, in late April, tallying fence repair estimates in a notebook, when Callum came around the corner of the barn with a bucket of feed and stopped. He looked at her for a moment, in the way he had been looking at her more often lately. Not the careful, assessing look of the first weeks, but something quieter than that. Something that stayed longer than it needed to. Vivienne, he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She had been Miss Aldcroft for 6 months. She looked up from the notebook. I've been meaning to say something, he said. He set the bucket down and looked at the fence line for a moment, and she could see that whatever it was, it had been sitting in him for some time. I'm not good at saying things. I know, she said. Then you know this is costing me something. She closed the notebook. He looked back at her. I don't know what your plans are. For the long term, if you're here because there wasn't anywhere else, or if you're here because... He stopped. I'd like you to stay, is what I'm saying. Not because of the books. The mud in the yard made small sounds in the morning quiet. A crow called from somewhere in the spruce trees. I know it's not because of the books, why, she said. He looked at her steadily. All right, I want to stay, she said. If we're being plain about it. Something happened in his face then, not a smile exactly, but a loosening, something releasing that had been held tight for a very long time. Then we won't have to say anything more about it, he said. No, she said. I don't think we will. He picked up the bucket and went to the cattle, and she opened her notebook again, but she did not write anything for a while. She just stood in the spring mud with the sun on her face and listened to the ordinary sounds of the farm. The cattle, the creak of the barn door, the spruce trees moving in the wind, and thought that this was enough, more than enough. This was the kind of life that asked you to earn it every day, and she had found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind earning things at all. They were married in the first week of June by the Justice of the Peace in Dunmore, on a Tuesday morning, which was the day they had always gone to town. Owen drove up from Medicine Hat for it, and shook Callum's hand, and told Vivienne she had made a good choice, as if she needed to be told. Bernard brought a jar of his wife's crabapple jelly, and left it on the kitchen table with a card that said only, "Good." She kept it on the windowsill all summer. The years that followed were not easy years, because no years in that part of the world are easy. There were drought seasons and cattle losses and a fire in the granary in the 3rd year that cost them 3 weeks of sleep. But the books stayed straight, and the land stayed theirs, and the house filled up in the way that houses do when people decide to stay in them, with children's boots by the door, and jars of preserves on the cellar shelves, and the sound of people moving through rooms at all hours, and sometimes, on a winter evening, when the stove was going, and the children were in bed, and Callum was reading in his chair, with his boots off, Vivienne would sit across from him with the account books and remember the woman who had walked down a frozen road with $31 in her coat and nowhere to go, and she would think, look at what you built. Not given, not inherited, built with her own hands one cold morning at a time. She thought that was worth something. She thought that was worth quite a lot.